My name is Ginny, also known as 2/3 Lotus, everywhere on the internet. This clip is part of my series, The Poets of Twitch, where I analyze my viewers' writing live on stream. Nothing has been edited out, so you're seeing this exactly as streamed with all of the imperfections and tangents that come with being live. If you want to catch me live or want more information, check out the description. Otherwise, enjoy some excellent writing. An untitled poem by Callie and HighCalliBrr. Are you okay with critique? Are you okay with chat, giving critique and feedback on this poem? And are you okay with this going eventually on the Poets of Twitch YouTube playlist? I think those are all the questions, right? Yes to all three. Okay, very well. I think we will jump right into it then. Need water. Moon, I think I might go be productive, in quotes. Productivity's a lie, but I do understand the need to produce as well. So, let's read this. The promise is, you'll take the world that I perceive, swallow up the senses that my soul has learned. In my years without you, to ignore, and have my soul receive an ecstasy, even in each moment. Alone, where I merely have to think about you, and I am placed where human souls retreat. Not to forget what it has been to live on earth, but to know what it is like to be held by someone more than divine, and become more indistinguishable from this sacred, indefinable thing, a loved one. Very nice. Talking about loved ones and perceptions. Both things that I like in poetry, and souls, and sacred divine things. It is interesting. Welcome, Drowning Double. How are you? Let's read it again. Maybe twice more, because it's short. The promise is, you'll take the world that I perceive, swallow up the senses that my soul has learned, in my years without you, to ignore, and have my soul receive an ecstasy, even in each moment alone, where I merely have to think about you. And I am placed where human souls retreat, not to forget what it has been to live on earth, but to know what it is like to be held by someone more than divine, and become indistinguishable from this sacred, indefinable thing, a loved one. You're good. I said hi earlier, but I had to finish something up. Okay. Well, hello again. Glad you're doing well. Petra, hello. Welcome and thank you. Yeah, today's work is analyzing 2 poems from viewers, and it should be good. So, I don't think I realized this on the first read because I was more focused on the words, but looking at some structure, things that pop out, of course. This is one sentence. The only period is at the end, and I think I didn't notice at first because you do have capitalization going on the first lines, which is interesting. We can maybe talk about like the one sentence poem and structure and capitalization and things. but very cool, all pointing toward this person, the loved one, and the things that they have shown you. One more read. The promise is you'll take the world that I perceive, swallow up the senses that my soul has learned in my years without you, to ignore, and have my soul receive an ecstasy, even in each moment alone, where I merely have to think about you. And I am placed where human souls retreat, not to forget what it has been to live on earth, but to know what it is like to be held by someone more than divine, and become indistinguishable from this sacred, indefinable thing, a loved one. And this is by HighCalliBrr, and is untitled. So, since it's such a big and complex sentence, what I want to do is break it down, simplify it a little bit to find meaning, right? Because when everything is one sentence and you have all of these commas and sometimes, like to ignore what is this pointing at? When everything's a comma, it can be a little hard to know what is sort of referring to what within the sentence, because there's a lot of commas. There's one here. I'm just using red to have them stick out. This is sometimes my criticism color, but this is just for the sake of pointing them out, and that'll help us separate the poem and divide it more appropriately. The promise is you'll take the world that I perceive, swallow up the senses that my soul has learned. Admittedly, there probably should be a comma there, grammatically, but the promise is you'll take the world that I perceive, swallow up the senses that my soul has learned in my years without you to ignore. So let's stop here. There's a lot there. The promise is you'll take the world that I perceive, swallow up the senses that my soul has learned in my many years without you to ignore, and have my soul receive an ecstasy. So, it seems that there's, like, referring to the promise is, trying to find what is the promise. Is it not necessarily meaning-wise yet, but which lines refer to the promise, right? In my many years without you to ignore, and have my soul receive an ecstasy, even in each moment alone, where I merely have to think about you. And I am placed where human souls retreat. So, and can often lead us to a new thing, or it can be an addition onto what we've already been saying. So, the promise is you'll take the world that I perceive. Something to do with giving people knowledge, swallowing up the senses that my soul has learned, again, in my years without you to ignore. Okay, so the senses that I've learned to ignore. And have my soul receive an ecstasy, even in each moment alone, where I merely have to think about you. And I am placed where human souls retreat. So, this might still be part of, like, the broader promise, placed where human souls retreat, but I think it could also be interpreted as it ending here, because you have and I am placed. Like, it's a full new subject, object, verb, or subject, verb, object, whatever. A new idea. Being placed where souls retreat, not to forget, as opposed to the perception, the soul, the comfort of thinking about you. Right? I think this is where we can divide the first section, which is still a lot, so we're probably going to break it down more, and that's okay. But it feels like there's kind of two parts to this one sentence poem. So again, I'm going to go back to ignore. I pointed out that this was referring to the senses, and I just want to break down the grammar here. Swallow up the senses that my soul has learned in my many years without you to ignore. So, swallow up the senses that my soul has learned. Learning senses is a fairly incomplete idea, so this gives me a hint that, we've learned to do something, right? You learn to run. You learn to, a baby learns to walk. You learn to do math. So just seeing learned, comma, generally says that there's something later that is going to describe what we have learned to do, right? It's just one of those words. So we have learned in my many years without you to ignore. And what have we learned to ignore? Swallow up the senses that my soul has learned to ignore. Right? What does that mean? Is the next question. Right? We figured out sort of what is pointing to what in this first sentence. The promise is, this person has promised me that you, this other person, will take the world that I perceive. Take. Get rid of. Remove from me. Swallow up. Again, the idea of taking something, making it yours, getting rid of it from myself. The senses that my soul has learned to ignore. The senses that my soul has learned in my years without you to ignore. What does it mean to ignore senses? That's sort of strange. We always see, hear, provided that we're able. Touch, taste, smell. These are things we do. How do we ignore them? Might find some help in the next lines. And have my soul receive an ecstasy where I merely have to think about you. Ecstasy even in each moment alone. This is just context to when the ecstasy is happening, where I merely have to think about you. So, this ecstasy, this emotion, sense, perhaps, is triggered only by thinking about you in this poem, right? And this is connected to the idea of them swallowing up my senses. So they swallow up the senses you've learned to ignore. They take away old senses and receive something new. So we are replacing the ignored senses, replace with ecstasy. Ecstasy. And I think that is to say that before meeting this person, before having this person to think about, this loved one, as we read before, there is an amount of numbness, right? When you are alone, perhaps, it is difficult to, for some, or maybe in comparison to having a relationship, it is difficult to feel the full breadth of emotion. You feel alone, you feel like you don't have someone by your side. This is a common sentiment. Not always true. There is beauty in solitude. However, with this person, even when alone, you can feel that ecstasy of being with them. So, the promise, perhaps the promise of love, as we circle back to at the end, is something that sort of gets rid of the ignoring of senses, the numbness, right? Love is greater than just to numbness, right? That's sort of what the first part is saying, or not necessarily that fact, but that with this person, the love of them, the love with them, overcomes the feelings that they've had of being numb before. And moving on, I am placed where human souls retreat, not to forget what it has been to live on earth, but to know what it is like to be held by someone more than divine, and become indistinguishable from this sacred, indefinable thing, a loved one. I am placed where human souls retreat. I think one immediate interpretation that might come to mind here is like an afterlife. Because the soul retreats. Once the body is dead, the soul moves on, something along those lines. But not to forget what it has been to live on earth. So it's saying, no, I'm placed where the soul retreats, where the soul is gone, but it's not death. Here, but to know what it is like to be held by someone more than divine and become indistinguishable from this sacred, indefinable thing. So I think this is to say that being held by the loved one, is something that allows the self to sort of melt away. The fact of me being my own soul is less important when I'm in the arms of a loved one, because I become indistinguishable, sort of one, indefinable, a union, right? A union of souls, right? So then this poem really is just describing, from an analytical point of view, in terms of meaning, that love, remember, the promise that love is, starting out, is to take someone into your arms, make them one with yourself, share that indistinguishable, indefinable thing, provide and receive ecstasy even when you are alone, find new emotion, new senses, and put old things behind you. Right? That's sort of my first interpretation of just what the words on the page are saying here, right? And I think they do it in a beautiful way. You have one sentence, it's continuous, and I do also think that there are probably ways that that can be tweaked to work slightly better. But there are also lots of things you do extremely effectively, HighCalliBrr, right? So the next thing will be to move on to maybe some critique, maybe some more analysis. But first, if chat has any questions or comments on other interpretations or other meanings, other things that they might have gotten from it, things that you feel I've missed, questions on specific things that you feel that I might have missed in this poem, let me know. Okay, then I'll presume... Oh, nothing from me. Okay, then I'll presume we're sort of hanging on. And as long as that makes sense, then we'll keep going to that. But first, I'm going to stand up briefly, take a quick stretch, and drink some water. Because I'm going to run a little self-care ad break. Please do not watch the ad. You stretch too. Good. Get up and stretch, like HighCalliBrr, like me, and don't watch the ad. Stretching is good for the soul. Oh, cracks. You're gonna submit something during this? Good. Okay. Good stretch, good drink of water. These things are healthy. And we'll be back to the poem in just a second. Okay. Hat, water. Welcome back. And we are going to continue into this poem without a title by HighCalliBrr. We have a basic overview of sort of the emotional content of this poem, that being the idea of love as a promise, which is an idea I like, an idea I do agree with, and describing the sort of beautiful things that love does, the effects it has on one's perceptions, one's experience of self, the quote-unquote soul. These are all lovely things. So, things that I notice about the poem. I said this at the very start, but this poem is one sentence. And that's really cool. I think poems that do this are beautiful. Being in the span of one sentence has some implications. Because we normally think of sentences as sort of complete units, right? A sentence is a complete thing. Generally, an incomplete sentence is an idea that is not fully written or explained, right? And so a sentence is like a unit, right? It is also like the smallest complete thing. You know, you can write in fragments, but those are not going to be, they might be smaller than a sentence, but they're not also going to be a complete idea, at least grammatically, right? So you have this small unit that is complete, that is a sentence, right? Now, also it tends to be incomplete relative to a broader idea, like a paragraph. However, it does say something in itself. And to reduce something to one sentence is to say also that I don't need more words, right? You could have written 100 sentences about this idea, but you wrote one. And why do we choose to do that? I think the main appeal is that saying this idea of I don't need more sentences, and then I'm using a singular, complete, small thing, is that it's sort of to say that the one sentence captures the whole thing. Right? It's efficient. And this is similar to the Japanese haiku, a poetic form we actually haven't talked about on Twitch. Right? And the point of the haiku. Now, a lot of people who speak English, or I don't know how often it's translated into other language, it probably is, but the idea that people talk about is 5, 7, 5. And this just means 5 syllables in the first line, 7, and then 5. This isn't exactly a nuanced understanding of the haiku, because it's reducing it to like a form, right? In the same way that we would call a sonnet iambic pentameter, which is like whatever, 14 lines of iambic pentameter, 3 quatrains and a couplet, right? But that's not what a sonnet is. A sonnet is a love poem, right? And a haiku, the true purpose of the haiku is to be complete. Haikus, written in their very short way, very incomplete, very fragmented, attempt to say something complete. And it's not just like say a sentence that is grammatically correct. That is to describe like everything. If that makes sense. To have the entire width and breadth of life in the smallest possible space. Hello, Will My Jr. And this is a really hard thing. And the more you reduce your poem down, let's say to one sentence, the more difficult it is to describe the whole nature of something, the complete nature of something. Which is why I think personally haiku is one of the hardest poetic forms to write. Because it wants to say something complete. And maybe we should have a haiku stream sometimes, but that's roughly the idea. So I almost compare the idea of writing a poem in one sentence to a slightly broader haiku, right? Which means we want to say everything, or close to everything. And I think this poem does do a good job of saying a lot, right? We describe love as this promise, this indistinguishable thing. We have it altering perception, the soul, sort of giving reference to life, the afterlife, sacred, divine. It definitely calls love a very powerful. I keep sliding my iPad. I need a glove. They're like these gloves that go in your hand. Describes love as this complete thing. but I think we can do better, because we can always do better, right? First of all, I want to point out structurally something. This might feel nitpicky, but I don't think it is. Okay, I think maybe, I don't know, this might sound harsh, but I feel it doesn't really satisfy me. I love the idea, but I feel you should have emphasized more of the stuff on how love is more divine, which you do to some extent, but I feel like it isn't shown enough. I don't know, though I'm going to make sense. I think that's a very good point. I do think you haven't described the entire breadth of love, and to be fair, you're not writing a haiku. The haiku aims to do that. Writing in one sentence doesn't necessarily. However, I think if we're writing a short poem, we want it to be distilled. We don't want to leave things out. And I'll get to that in a second, the sort of actual language you use. But first I want to talk about some structural things. Right? You capitalize the beginning of every line. I noticed this right at the start, and I said it made it more difficult for me to notice that it was one sentence, because capitalized letters tend to indicate a new sentence, right? And as you read this, you almost want to read it. When you see the capital letter, the promise is you'll take the world that I perceive, swallow up the senses that my soul has learned, in my years without you to ignore. The capital letters signal something new, when very clearly with your use of commas, it is not. It's one idea, right? And I think that is maybe a misstep, because you are trying to have this one singular idea throughout, which really does contribute. The idea of one sentence being all you need to describe love as this continuous, unified thing, it makes sense. Like, the structure of one sentence to describe love is, I think, a very useful, a very poignant one. But it means you want to lean into the advantages of one sentence and make it feel more continuous. And I do think the capital letters take away from that. And something else, I added a colon here at the start, just because for my description of saying what is the promise, right? And of course the promise is sort of the whole thing, but saying the promise is, and then having a whole bunch of text kind of makes me wonder, where is the part about the promise going to end, and where are we going to say something different? Right? Perhaps a title could help, right? For example, if the poem was titled The Promise, we would know that the whole thing is relating to the title, The Promise. Or, for example, we could signal that the promise is meant to be the entire thing. And one way, since we already used a colon down here, could be the promise is colon. All of this. And then we see a colon at the end. And it kind of feels like, oh, between these two colons is one thing. And if we look to connect them, we could even say the promise is a loved one. The more grammatical punctuation mark in that sense would be like the big dash going through, but either one works, right? So that could be another idea to bring some unification through your poem that is trying to say like one thing. Also, titles do this. I know you don't normally title your poems, and that's fine. But in my opinion, a title should relate to everything. Why would I title my poem with something if my entire poem does not fit under that title? Right? So, titles are hard, but I do think a title as simple as The Promise. I know it sounds maybe sort of cliche, but I think it works really well here in particular, because you are kind of saying, I think that the whole thing, that a loved one, that this relationship as a whole is a promise, right? Titles are so important. You should try them. Sometimes they even make or break my poems. Yeah. They can be used as a literary tool in so many ways I struggle to explain just how it's so good. Yeah. So, the title can be used to describe the poem, like I'm sort of saying here, the title encompassing it. The title can be used to sort of introduce the poem as well. Not necessarily to speak to the whole thing as a broad stroke, but you could also have it be almost a pseudo first line. You could have the title be, The Promise Is, and literally take this bit, move it up to the top middle, and then say, you'll take the world that I perceive. That's an option. Shouting Devil, I love titles so much. They can tell you so much about a poem. Yeah. The title can feel different. It can feel separate from the poem, in fact, and then add new context. So let's say I read the title, and it doesn't make much sense, and then I read through the poem, and it's like, oh, this is talking about loved ones, and I go back to the title, and it's like something different. If I were to title it, it would be Keep Me. Yeah, so this would maybe be a title that adds more context beyond the poem, right? The promise is you'll do these things, all of this, a loved one. And then Keep Me would be addressed to this loved one, right? Adding additional context. Keep Me does say maybe there is some amount of chance of them not keeping you. It shows that this is keep me. It's a request as much as it is like a hope, and it has a lot of feeling. Keep me, right? It's good, and it goes beyond anything in this poem. Nothing in this poem is asking to be kept. Is you asking to be kept. So adding that additional context could be interesting, right? I agree with that too. So titles can do a lot of things. I'm not saying you have to do a title. Again, we also discussed how this is a poem in one sentence, right? And if we have this one singular complete thing, right? I put this on the page, and here are the lines, right? That's the poem. It is complete. This says, I do not need anything but the words here to fill this page and have a worthwhile idea, right? If you add a title with a space, you know, it can feel sort of like it messes up this dynamic. So there is an argument for both sides I tend to argue both sides here when I'm explaining things, and it is your decision whether no title or title makes more sense. Whether you want to stick to the one sentence, or whether you want to add something to it. But again, that then says, is a title worth more than no title? Is a title worth more than no title? And you might think, some people might immediately think, well, yes, it adds more meaning. But sometimes just adding meaning is not the objective here. Sometimes there's a point to not having the title. Sometimes there's a point to saying that this is a singular, complete, haiku-like sentence. Haikus generally don't have titles, right? Because that would just be extra. So there's some thoughts there, right? I'd like to point out something grammatical as well, which I don't normally spend too much time on, but since part of our structure is purely that we are doing this thing, playing with grammar, writing one sentence to say something, we should be fairly careful with our grammar. The promise is, you'll take the world that I perceive, swallow up the senses that my soul has learned. I think this is an unfortunate mistake. You didn't put a comma here, because that is a run-on sentence if you just read it through. You'll take the world that I perceive. That is a sentence. You, I, take. Subject, object, verb. Or you'll take the world. That's a full sentence, right? Swallow up the senses that my soul has learned is a fragment. But again, we have a new verb and we have a new object, which means we do need the comma here for grammatical purposes. And I think that's what threw me the most on the first read, which made it not feel like one sentence, because I immediately saw, you'll take the world that I perceive. Oh, look, a new verb, that's a new sentence, it's capitalized. You've signaled in many, many ways here that this is a first separate idea. So, lowercase, add the comma, swallow up the senses that my soul has learned in my years without you to ignore. And have my soul receive an ecstasy, even in each moment alone, where I merely have to think about you. And I am placed where human souls retreat. Not to forget what it has been to live on earth. So, not is again sort of a, what is this called? It's like and, it's like but. Conjunction, I think. I don't really know grammar very well. But the point is, I am placed where human souls retreat is a full idea. If we want to add something more, we need a comma here, so that this doesn't feel like, again, the same thing, a sentence and a complete idea, which is something that you might see dead in the middle of the poem, a new idea. So this is a dangerous place to make a grammatical mistake, and you unfortunately maybe did, unless you're intending that, which is cool. I think there is some reason, maybe, in intentionally using non-grammatical things, but generally it feels like you're shooting for the one sentence. Not to forget what it has been to live on Earth, but to know it has been to be held someone more than divine, comma, and become indistinguishable from this indefinable thing, a loved one. 2 commas and I think it works, right? Maybe just needed more time to refine. It's obvious that there's a lot of emotion. Absolutely. I like this poem a lot. That's what I was thinking, yeah. This poem is good, but of course everything could be improved. Can we ask, were the capital letters intentional or a mistake? I don't like going back to make everything lowercase. Sometimes my document makes it capitalized again. I have to backspace like 2 to 3 times. Yeah, I figured that was the case. And like that's an annoying thing with word processors. But I do think that extra bit of work to make it lowercase does a ton for the poem. And maybe this shows you why, my explanation, right? Where detail is important in a poem, especially a poem as short as this. In a very long poem, let's say the poem we read a few days ago, When God Burns, calling you out, Penguino Man, for your long poem. This is a long poem. It's 3 pages long. I do not have the time, the energy, nor the attention to look at why I, Mr. Penguino Man, put a comma right here. You know? Because this is absolutely nothing compared to this, right? But when you write a poem this short, when you do, you play a really dangerous game with short poems. You give me so little space, your reader, not just me, right, to find interpretation, that if the reader spends time, they are more quickly going to look at things like capitalization, punctuation, little formatting tools, right? And then people notice, hey, size doesn't matter. Well, it doesn't affect the quality of the poem being long or short. However, a long poem needs different sort of care and attention, and you need to use different techniques to read and analyze a long poem. Where if you have a short poem, there are different things you can and maybe should do to take the most meaning and perhaps emotional pleasure from a shorter poem. Again, different techniques. So, it does matter. It's just not a matter of quality, right? So in the case of this short poem, you are giving me a chance. You're basically asking me to look deeper at each word. And that goes back to the haiku. The haiku has just a few words, maybe a few syllables if you're looking at this anglicized meaning, but you're saying, the haiku says, I only give you a handful of words, and I want you to pull meaning from it. And that means that every word is going to have more. Every little detail is intentional. So, when you write a poem this length, that is just the reality, right? A short poem is usually uber analyzed when things like punctuation can indicate different meanings. It's crucial. Yeah. And I want to show you, I do this not intentionally. If I go back, Liza Rise Up sent a poem quite a while ago. 2 really short poems. This was the poem we read a few weeks ago on stream from Liza Rise Up. 4 lines, 19 words it looks like, right? They sent 2 poems. We didn't even get to this one because I spent 2 hours, not 2 hours, maybe an hour and a half, talking about this one, right? So yeah. Unfortunately, like, think about it this way. Treat your short poem, treat your short poetry like a long poem. If I write a short poem, right? A short poem, it shouldn't be that I give it, this thing, less time, less detail, less attention than a long poem, right? And I'm not necessarily saying you haven't given this poem proper time, detail, and attention. In your case, I'm saying this is a broader rule, but than a long poem. This poem, the long poem, happens to get many words and is sprawling across multiple pages, right? But the short poem should not just be that much of a long poem. It should be the long poem all smashed together into the space of the short poem, right? That's the idea. So you end up with the same amount of emotion, the same amount of care as the long one, right? And then, once you start writing short poems like this, then when you go write a long poem, you should ask, well, why isn't my long poem having the density of attention of a short poem and just have, like, basically more words? And then you'll realize you can do that, and you can make a really long, extremely dense poem. And you'll say, wait, I can put this much density into a long poem. Why am I not, when I write short poems, this is the cycle, why am I not shrinking this down to a short poem and writing things like this that are super, super dense? And that's how you get, that's one way to get better at poetry, right? Try different things. Try to make any other form as emotional as anything else you can, and repeat. Eventually, the result of all of this, the big moral, as you continue to try to get more emotion and more stuff into your poems, is you'll drive yourself crazy. And that's our goal as poets. So, sort of the reality. You do need to stop at some point, admittedly. Or you'll take the Bukowski direction, and this will turn you into an alcoholic. Not that alcoholics are crazy, but, you know, you'll need to cope. I really got y'all with that one. So, those are the choices we make in poetry. It's like, there's gotta be a clip. I'm gonna add a stream marker for that. So, this man is not even not even a professional drunk. Someday I will be. Bukowski's great. So, that's the reality of poetry, is, unfortunately, saying my word processor capitalizes the letters on its own. Well, your word processor isn't a poet. Your word processor doesn't know what's best for your poem, so you either go in, change your word processor So it doesn't do anything automatically, and it doesn't do anything that you don't tell it to. Or you get a new one, or you write by hand. Because the most important thing is for yourself expressing everything you want to intentionally in your poem. Right? We talk about artistic intention. And if I see a bunch of capitals and you've like full on published your work, I am no longer going to assume that these are maybe points for critique or things that might have been done wrong, right? It's going to change my interpretation of the meaning. I'm going to go through and say, well, wait, maybe you're implying some amount of separation in the continuity of the sentence. And then I have to reevaluate and say, maybe there's an underpinning structural separation to this love, that there's some non-grammatical stuff. There's these capital letters separating it. These could legitimately be the poet trying to say that it is not perfectly continuous, and there's doubt here, and there's some shakiness in the promise. And if you want to, you can do that. And there are probably more additional ways to do that as possible, right? Bukowski is the problem child that a lot of people seem to like for some reason. Yeah, I like him. Or be like me and constantly yell at Google Docs that I'm using British English. You can change that in your settings. You don't need to yell at Google Docs. Sorry I'm not responding much. I got tired all of a sudden. I should drink coffee. Well, if you're tired, you should sleep. Take a nap. But no worries. As long as you are enjoying it and getting help. But yelling at Google Docs is funny. I did it keeps thinking I'm a yank. Okay, well, I can't help you there. You're gonna drink the bean water. I'm gonna drink the regular water and take a quick self-care ad break so you can grab some coffee to wake up, and we'll keep talking about this poem. I think I have a few more things to say, but I need to stretch and I need to rest my voice a little bit. So I'm gonna run this ad. Don't watch it. Hey, Harper. Hi, good boy. Good boy. All right. That's enough. That's enough stretching. I drank a special type of coffee recently. The beans were fed to a certain animal, and then digested beans were dug out of the poo and used. Apparently it tastes better than it does. It tastes like chocolate. I mean, I guess as long as it's sanitary. You do you. It makes some sense. I don't know. That is something though. Yeah. Alright. Back to the poem. What do I want to talk about? So we have this idea of continuity. We have this idea, in the poem as well, of always being together. Have my soul receive an ecstasy, even in each moment alone, where I merely have to think about you. And I am placed where human souls retreat, not to forget what it has been to live on earth, but to know what it is like to be held by someone more than divine, and become indistinguishable from this sacred, indefinable thing, a loved one. So, another question, if the point of this poem, the point of everything we want to describe in love, is the becoming one, becoming indistinguishable, always having them when you are alone, etc., etc., with the loved one, how can we, through our words, improve our depiction of this? Penguino Man earlier said that they feel something was missing. I think specifically you said you wanted more discussion of the feeling that it was divine. And if you have any, I think it was Penguino Man, correct me if I'm wrong, but I would love to hear your thoughts, Penguino Man, on how you think that could be used more throughout this poem, right? Right, constructive. Yeah, you say it's not showed enough. So if you have thoughts, let me know. And because that is reasonable, I think divinity is sort of an important thing when you mention it in a poem. And as it relates to a loved one, and as it relates to promises, divinity is super powerful to use in a poem, right? You talk about promises, that's a divine thing. You talk about indistinguishable, or like becoming one, and that's something you hear as like a religious thing, becoming one with God, or one with the universe, or one with whatever, being indistinguishable, or that you are a piece of some God. I'm not talking about any specific faith in particular. I think there are lots that use this. But divinity is certainly a powerful thing, and it could be used more deeply throughout the poem, right? So I wonder about the word ecstasy here. Ecstasy, of course, is a great, powerful joy. It is something overwhelming. But I think ecstasy, often as a word, has a slight negative connotation. One, maybe slightly because there's a drug called ecstasy. But if we define ecstasy.
overwhelming feeling of joyous or excitement, but then 2, an emotional or religious frenzy or trance-like state originally involving mystical self-transcendence or an amphetamine, right? So there are a few meanings, and they have different levels of use, right? And ecstasy definitely can bring in the religious sense, which I like, but you could use other words in its stead. Soul receives a euphoria. Maybe that's just a word I like as a trans person. But there are other things you can use. I think, because sometimes ecstasy is a less palatable word for some, right? You're not necessarily in control when you're ecstatic, which is useful for love, right? It is a true depiction. Maybe just something basic like senses. Describe how you can describe something as maybe ordinary, as intimacy. Feels so incredible that it becomes divine or ecstatic. So Pinguino Man says there are many ordinary things in love, and that you would want to describe those things. No worries, I understand. You can describe those things as ecstatic because love does that. Like the sight of them, or describing the emotional intimacy and how in the pocket you are with each other, that it might border on the divine. Yeah. Describe just how this promise in love is so transcending and divine. Yeah, so it's an option. And, for example, I think the other thing about this part of the poem, this sort of line and a half, and have my soul receive an ecstasy, even in each moment alone. You do also talk about becoming indistinguishable with someone, right? In a sense that maybe instead of receiving an ecstasy when you are alone, you rather are given this promise that you can cling to remind you that you are not alone, right? Saying that there are times when you are alone is almost contradictory with the idea of becoming indistinguishable with another person. Because if this promise of love is so overwhelming, it might be to the point where in fact you are not alone when you are alone. If that makes sense. And that could be something for that line, but also, yeah. And the difficult thing, Pinguino Man, is that often being descriptive in terms of showing action and a scene, of describing intimacy, can take a long time, a lot of words. And it's advice that I've given you, Pinguino Man, because it's good advice, but it usually works well in longer settings, is one issue. Where sometimes when you get shorter, you need to be a lot more metaphorical, or describe a scene that means something else. Right? So it's difficult. And you definitely could try to describe in a very, very short space an actual scene with this feeling. Maybe I can try to show an example. Would that be good? Use one of Pinguino Man's. Something ordinary, like the sight of them. So how might I, in a super condensed setting, describe seeing someone? You're not going to see me do some poetry, maybe. Seeing someone and using this mere plain action to describe the entire breadth, width, and incredible nature and the promise of love. That sounds difficult. sounds like writing a haiku, because that's sort of what each little part would be like. So, first of all, I guess I'm going to do it outside of the context of your poem. I'm not going to try to write in your poem, right? But we do have the idea of a promise. And perhaps sometimes I just like to write words. And this might look like me writing an entire poem because I need to find the right words and distill it down. So sometimes when I write a poem, I just write a ton of words related to this. So the idea of eyes meeting or locking, that definitely feels like the idea of a promise, right? You can talk about, if we're talking senses, the color, the sound of their voice as you greet them, although it's more about seeing them, right? So you can go into colors. This is an easy way to engage the five senses, show don't tell sort of thing. And if we're talking looking at someone, let's say the eyes, we can do, you have options: blue, green, hazel, brown, whatever, all these things describing eyes. You have, what else could we do? Maybe I can pull from here. Eyes meeting, eyes locking, glance, a gaze, resting. I like that. Once you give yourself the bar to uphold of describe the entire nature of something in as few words as possible, you make your life really difficult. So this is difficult, right? You have pupils. It's funny because I've sort of written a poem like this before. You have different parts of the idea, or the eyes, lashes. Maybe to make it not like your poem, make it more personal to me, because sometimes when you have this deep level emotion, you can't write about something that's less true. So maybe I'll write about sort of bad love and pain. In that sense, you have a lot of words. You have lashes, eyelashes, but lashes, pain, eyes locking, being stuck in relationships. Not my current relationship, past ones. My current girlfriend's great. But these double meanings can be great. These additional things. These are all good options. So, and it's about putting it together into an actual poetic line, which is again very, very difficult. So let me just do this. Your eyes. Your eyes lock me in, every glance, 100 lashes. Right? Double meanings, including seeing this person's, you can even say like 100 long or beautiful or how would I describe eyelashes? I would probably add another word here to describe the lashes, maybe do something with the glance, but you get the idea. Like, I can describe some more of this scene, locking eyes, and in a very dense case, which I feel this is unfinished, write some actual poetry, right? This is sort of out of focus, I feel. Yeah, that's better. Okay. So, that's just like an idea. Sort of an example of how you could take an action, your eyes meeting, right? And expand it, because I can say our eyes meet, or I can say that your love hurts me like lashes, or that your love is painful, or I can say something more like this, right? And this isn't a whole poem, it's a fragment. That probably made it harder to write, but that's fine, right? So you get the idea. These are things that can be done, and even that unfinished thing took a while, and that is why sometimes writing a short poem and trying to give it the density of a long poem, again, drives you crazy, because it's really hard, and it takes a long time, and why short poems should, maybe, take as much time as poems many, many, many times their length. And I'm not necessarily going to give you any sentences, or not sentences, this is one sentence, any ideas within the poem, because it's not my place. These are your ideas. I try fairly often not to try to add to your poem, right? Because at the end of the day, it's a beautiful work, and it's complete, and you've sent it to me. And I don't want to say, by adding, essentially, that I feel I know better, right? Occasionally I will. I did it with Penguino Man a couple days ago, because I felt like I understood the poem. Life's a living contradiction, y'all. But these are ideas, so you can definitely do that. But even then, this is like a full line within your poem, and that would take up a lot of space and have to be eased into and out of, especially when a lot of your writing already is very metaphorical, not very locked in place and in senses, which is tricky, right? To say, try to add senses and sights and actual concrete things to this poem can be an impossible task. This sort of back to the haiku is why I think the haiku is one of the hardest poems, because it specifically tends to demand you write about nature in like the original purest form of the haiku. They're poems about nature and or like simple things that describe the entirety of life. Concrete things. Haikus don't do any telling. They don't do any thinking normally, they are just events, right? So, it makes them harder, and it makes this harder. And it's your choice, I guess, what you want to do from there. So you could take this poem, smooth out the continuity, smooth out the idea of a single sentence, bring in these ideas, words that contribute, like indistinguishable, to the idea of it being one complete thing, this love, this promise. You could lead into the idea of the divine, like Pinguino Man suggests. This would maybe contribute to the idea of singularity and indistinguishable and love and all these things, but it might not be your personal taste. You could add more that is concrete and visual and sensory. That's an option. You could go the other way, and maybe you thought the sound of breaking up the poem and making it less continuous to describe love as a less perfect thing would be a beautiful poem and a good idea. You could write a whole new poem or 3 more with all of these new ideas, right? And that's going to be your decision. But I think maybe I've given you as much as I can give you here. So if anyone else has thoughts, if you want to get me talking again and have some prompting for me to yap about this poem for another half hour, do tell. Otherwise, I'll read it one time, call it there, and then we'll move on to another work. And Pinguino Man, you said, I think I may have even asked for it because I was so sick of that poem. Yeah, I think that was something. Nothing else from Pinguino Man. HighCalliBrr, you sent a face. I presume that means you are appreciative. Okay. It sounds like there's nothing else, so I'm going to read this poem by Callie one more time, and that will be a wrap on this one. Here goes. Untitled by HighCalliBrr. The promise is, you'll take the world that I perceive, swallow up the senses that my soul has learned in my years without you to ignore, and have my soul receive an ecstasy even in each moment alone, where I merely have to think about you, and I am placed where human souls retreat, not to forget what it has been to live on earth, but to know what it is like to be held by someone more than divine, and become indistinguishable from this sacred, indefinable thing, a loved one. By HighCalliBrr. Thank you for watching. I encourage you to check out the rest of the series, follow if you enjoyed, and stop by Twitch if you want to share your own work. See you there.